So Groundhog Day is a thing.
It's Groundhog Day!
I missed it by a week, but that's just how it goes. I don't have infinite time. Unlike Phil Connors, amazing segue, because of course the film shares its name with the holiday. I didn't see Groundhog Day until I was in my undergrad. Before this, I was always aware of the premise, but I found the idea of a movie based on one day repeating over and over kind of absurd. That's a joke for all my existentialists out there. I didn't understand how there could be any kind of forward momentum to a movie if everything kept repeating over and over. Unlike Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, where the ending of the movie can be interpreted as a cycle, spoilers I guess, Groundhog Day was just the same day repeated as the whole plot. But after watching the movie, I instantly understood. Okay, not instantly. Phil is actually an incredibly unlikable character, which I found rather strange, but by the end of the movie, I understood that the cycle was about his progression and character growth, and I really appreciated Bill Murray's comedy as both Phil the asshole and Phil the stand-up guy. But apart from being a romantic comedy with a very unique premise, I didn't really think any deeper into the movie at the time. Fast forward to my master's, where one night I was hanging out with a bunch of film archive students, like the fucking nerd I am, and I got invited to a screening of Groundhog Day on Groundhog Day in an arts museum. And the movie was still amazing, but this time around I was older, wiser, more understanding. Not really, I had just read more philosophy and started making connections. Groundhog Day is a ridiculously fun and humorous movie, and arguably one of Bill Murray's best, or at least his most memorable. Well, maybe Ghostbusters. It's defined as a romantic comedy for obvious reasons, but it has a lot more going for it because the movie is very concerned with philosophy. And it's not just in the narrative, but in the actual mechanics of the movie's basic plot conceit. Underneath all the romance and comedy, Groundhog Day's skeletal structure is one that asks a lot of questions about the nature of life and the way we should live it. And it does this through Phil's character arc in an existential sense, a moral sense, and how it explores the actuality of reliving the same day forever. And so today, I want to talk about Groundhog Day. And so today, I want to talk about Groundhog Day. And so today, I want to talk about Groundhog Day. And so today, I want to talk about Groundhog Day. Even the initial idea for the film began from a place of critical thought, mixed with just the right amount of imagination. Author and screenwriter Danny Rubin was interested in vampires, but not for the usual reasons, what with the sex and the lust, but in how an immortal creature would fill its limitless time. What kinds of things would a person do without temporal restrictions like dying?
I'm a god.
But a film about eternity was impractical for obvious reasons, so Rubin opted to explore the idea of a single day repeated in perpetuity. First, because this was a far more realistic proposition for filming, and second, because it offered more opportunities for human and comedic moments. Supposedly, Rubin always wanted this repeated day to be more than just an average day, so he flipped open his calendar to the closest holiday and landed on Groundhog Day, which admittedly is a pretty outlandish holiday and rife with opportunities for comedy. For those that are from other parts of the world, this is an actual thing that happens in the United States and Canada. The holiday, not the weather prediction. Rubin's script made the rounds in Hollywood, and though it was not picked up, it did get him many meetings for other ideas. About a year after finishing the script, Rubin connected with famous actor and director Harold Ramis of Ghostbusters fame. Ramis liked the script and offered to help make it a reality with a budget backed by Columbia. For Rubin, this was a dream come true, and he signed on to help rework the script with Ramis's help. The pair worked tirelessly together, but ran into a few snags. Ramis wanted the movie to focus on comedy, whereas Rubin wanted to explore the philosophical implications. Things only became more problematic when Bill Murray was cast and wanted to put his own brand of comedy into the script and have a say on the headier ideas of the film. To top it all off, the studio also wanted to make their own changes and kept pushing for an exploration to the rules of the time loop. The four parties continued to work well past the film's production start date, and details and story beats of scenes were sometimes chosen during their filming. Unfortunately, the town of Punxsutawney was far too small and could not support the needs of a film crew, and so they had to find another location that could serve their needs while still looking like any other timeless American town. Because of this, the town refused to let the film crew use the actual Punxsutawney Phil, and so the crew had to find another groundhog, and apparently they just found one in the wild and used it instead. The movie was released in 1993 and fared decently well at the box office, which is saying something because that was a stacked year. Free Willy, The Nightmare Before Christmas, The Sandlot, Schindler's List, frickin' Jurassic Park came out that year. So if you at least got some notoriety in a year that stacked, you're doing okay. Beyond its monetary legacy, the film has become widely referenced as an indication of the repetition and monotony of one's life, and is a holiday classic that many watch every year on its namesake. Groundhog Day is an absolute masterpiece, and you're probably at least familiar with the premise, but it's worth seeing on its own rather than just relying on my shitty summary. So if you want to save yourself from that, this is your spoiler warning. Mean-spirited weatherman Phil Connors is being sent to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania to cover the annual Groundhog Day festivities, and the people there make a big deal out of it. Clearly, Phil doesn't agree and proceeds to antagonize his camera guy Larry and producer Rita.
People are morons.
Nice attitude.
The next morning, Phil wakes up and seems to be accosted by the overly cheery nature of the townsfolk, including a rather zealous former acquaintance.
Needle-nosed Ned the Head? Come on, buddy, Case Western High!
Phil eventually makes his way to Gobbler's Knob with enough time to film Punxsutawney Phil and his intro and outro, but not have to deal with the rest of the festivities. Having done their job, the trio attempt to head back to the city, but are forced to return to Punxsutawney due to a blizzard. A blizzard that Phil predicted wouldn't hit them because he's also a shitty weatherman.
What blizzard? It's a couple of flakes!
Phil resigns himself to spending another night in town and wakes up only to find it's the exact same day with the exact same misfortunes.
Watch out for that first step, it's a doozy!
Phil then realizes he is repeating the same day over and over again. He spends the first couple of renditions trying to figure out if he is going mad or what else could be wrong with him, but soon realizes that this loop means an utter lack of consequences and begins spending his time eating whatever he wants, doing whatever he wants, and a third example I'll think of later. Eventually, the endless repetition becomes tedious to Phil. He once again tries to find any way to escape the loop, including dying in ever more drastic and creative ways, which culminates in the kidnapping of Punxsutawney Phil while committing Grand Theft Auto.
That's not bad for a quadruped. You gotta check your mirrors, just the side of your eye.
He then launches himself and the groundhog off a cliff in a spectacular finale, only to wake up once again on the same day. At this point, Phil talks with Rita in earnest instead of just trying to get into her pants. They spend the whole day together and he feels a genuine connection and hopes that it will last. She convinces Phil that perhaps the cycle is not a curse, but could be a blessing. Phil then spends every day trying to learn new things. He takes up hobbies, reads, and begins paying attention to the people around him, Larry, Rita, and the other townsfolk. One day, Phil gives a very different rendition of his newscast, and then spends the rest of the day helping the people in town in various ways before meeting with Rita at the final Groundhog Day event. Rita is perplexed at how well everyone knows Phil and that he doesn't seem to be the same jerk she remembers from the day before. They then spend the rest of the day together, and Phil wakes up, but this time, Rita is with him.
Anything different is good.
It's finally tomorrow, and Phil is excited by all the new possibilities that this brand new day and every day after that will grant him. Phil's journey from self-centered narcissist to a well-rounded and caring person can be split into two parts, his existential journey and his moral journey. These two parts are inextricably linked to each other and happen at the same time, but for the sake of flow in this video, I'm going to start with his existential journey. I just think starting from the question of why should I live leads really nicely into how should I live. Phil's response to the repeating cycle changes over time. We might even split this into periods. The original idea was to have these periods adhere to the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, and you can definitely see some of that left over, but I think that these periods actually follow distinct existentialist ideologies. The first existential phase is Phil's dive into hedonism. Here he lives consequence-free and does things because he can. This is certainly one way of living, and I actually think it's a perfectly fine way of living. No one seems to be affected by any of Phil's actions in the loops, so anything Phil does to anyone else becomes non-existent, so any actions are in essence harmless. Phil is trying to make the best of his situation by doing anything and everything he can. This could be seen as Phil seizing the day and doing everything he can to make his existence better, and since no one else is negatively impacted, it seems that this is a fine way to exist. But I do wonder if this is maybe an empty way to exist. Jean-Paul Sartre argues that the purpose for existence is to live your life the best way you can, as if it was a representation for how everyone else ought to live their life. Phil may live consequence-free in the loop, but his actions have very little meaning beyond instant gratification. And while it's a great way to pass one day, it's not a great way to live a life, as most of these events are fleeting fulfillments. This lack of fulfillment leads Phil to his next phase, where he becomes disenfranchised. He isn't just trying to break the loop, but actively stop his own existence. After spending countless weeks within the confines of one day, Phil reaches his limit and begins to search for any way of escaping. But there is no escape. There is no reprieve, because the loop has no rules. Phil has reached nihilism, where nothing matters, and this could have been a dark section of the movie, but instead it's done with a comedic tone and treats a lot of Phil's attempts with a humorous flair, particularly the Grand Theft Rodent incident. But I think that the nihilistic ideas actually benefit from this comedic tone. Phil sees no meaning in his life or in constantly existing in the loop, but this part of the movie is even more nihilistic than Phil is, because even his attempts don't matter.
I have been stabbed, shot, poisoned, frozen, hung, electrocuted, and burned.
Oh, really?
This is bleak, but the fact that his actions don't matter even when he is attempting to end his existence leads Phil to his next phase. After Rita tells Phil,
I don't know, Phil. Maybe it's not a curse. Just depends on how you look at it.
Phil begins to look at the loop in a different way. He starts embracing the time he has constructively. We also see him take an interest in learning how to save people, although he also learns he cannot save everyone. This way of filling his days with art and reading, as well as truly helping people who will not remember what he has done, is more in line with Sartre's idea of how we should live in a certain way. But the decision to look at his life this way feels more like Albert Camus' absurdism. Apart from the fact that his own attempts on his life were a joke, the whole time loop itself seems to be some kind of cosmic joke at Phil's expense, which is very much in line with Camus' idea of the absurd joke of living. The fact that Phil has a change of heart and chooses to live his life more meaningfully reflects Camus' idea of imagining ourselves happy. In his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus argues that we could imagine the titular ancient prisoner of Tartarus happy as he rolls the boulder up the mountain, because he could find meaning in the pushing of the boulder. Phil too finds happiness in the way he goes through the loop, but more than that, he decides to find happiness in the loop. Nothing matters, so he chooses to live his life to the best of his abilities, and he chooses to make his own meaning and happiness out of the way he pursues his interests in each day. And when the loop does end, he seems to take that with him. It's kind of like Scrooged, except instead of 4 ghosts setting Bill Murray straight, it's an infinite amount of time and contemplation. And just like Scrooged, it was an internal choice that made the difference. It seems to me that Phil answers the question of why should I live with a simple because I want to. And from here we can look at his moral arc. By the end of the movie, Phil has a fervor for life, but instead of a selfish need to indulge in his own whims, he is more thoughtful, engaging, and altogether a better person who cares about others. Personally, I think that Phil is embodying Sartre's idea of humanism, but that's just my interpretation. There are, of course, many other readings. For instance, there are quite a few references to religion in the film.
You're not a god. You can take my word for it. This is 12 years of Catholic school talking.
Because of this, I don't think it would be unreasonable to read this film as a religious redemption. Phil only leaves the loop once he has become a better person, and Christian literature loves a good redemption story, allegory or otherwise. And the movie does seem to back this up. Phil does become not just a more stand-up citizen, but also seems to take on a lot of Judeo-Christian values. Some other scholars think that instead of an existential morality, Phil's change of heart comes from an ancient form of philosophy called virtue ethics. Way back in the day, Aristotle proposed the idea that your character was the sum of your actions, so your actions could over time change your behavior, which would become your character. If this follows, then Phil carrying out the good deeds would lead him to become a better person. This is the same reason why Chidi chooses to help Eleanor in The Good Place, by the way.
Are we sure we should be paying attention to these guys? It's like who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
Plato.
I can see the appeal of this interpretation of the film, but I think the choice to choose life and learn about the people around him voluntarily is more meaningful than the sum of his good actions turning him into a good person. Because if that were the case, then being a good person could be calculated by the total number of good actions you do, and I think that undercuts the point of Phil's change of heart. There is another aspect to the movie that plays into the virtue ethics and Judeo-Christian reading, and that is the nature of the loop itself. It would appear that the way the narrative frames the loop seems to indicate that the point of the loop is for Phil's benefit. He enters the loop, and the loop doesn't end until he is a better person, or until he discovers true love, depending on how you want to read it. As I said, this is in line with a lot of Judeo-Christian literature. But the movie doesn't give us any of the rules as to how the mechanics of the loop function. So while I can see that narratively it appears that the loop is some kind of tool for teaching Phil how to become less selfish and arrogant, it could easily be any number of other things. The ambiguity of the loop's meaning in the film is fascinating, and actually leads me to think that it might be another philosophical idea. Friedrich Nietzsche reintroduced the world to the idea of the eternal recurrence. In his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he gives the example of a demon forcing a person into a constant repetition of their life, and then asks the question, would you rail against this demon, or view the reliving of every experience as a blessing? I've already shown a few existential theories around how the loop might push someone to live, but it seems to me that Groundhog Day could be a direct way to interpret both answers to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. Phil begins by cursing the hell he has been trapped in, but eventually he learns to embrace the repetition. The problem with this interpretation is that the loop isn't exact every day. Phil is capable of changing his actions from day to day, so it's not a recurrence in the exact sense, and because this concept is like most things Nietzsche did, which is to say obtuse and hard to figure out, several other philosophers have attempted to interpret what he meant. Some scholars think that Nietzsche was being 100% literal about the eternal recurrence, and that the universe would occur limitless times with no changes to how it unfolded. Others believed that Nietzsche was far less literal, and that this was just a thought experiment on how to live your life. If the former, then what does that say about free will? I know a lot of Western religions are very protective of their free will as a concept. But if the latter, then we might see Groundhog Day as one possible version of a thought experiment played out through fiction. This would explain Phil's choices when he's stuck in the loop, both the defiance beforehand and the acceptance of it later, as well as a lot of his moral choices. For me, it also helps explain the arbitrary nature of the loop, or rather that the loop needs no explanation. If we wanted to take the open interpretation to the extreme, we could read this another way. This is me being facetious, so take this reading with a grain of salt, but if we take the narrative as our framing device for the loop, you'll notice a few details. First, the loop begins on Groundhog Day. Duh. But this is important because what is Punxsutawney Phil other than a groundhog?
The seer of seers, prognosticator of prognosticators.
That's right, he predicts the seasons. And apart from being a force of nature, the seasons are also a passage of time. So I propose that Phil's shit-talking of Groundhog Day and the town pissed off Punxsutawney Phil.
This is one time where television really fails to capture the true excitement of a large squirrel predicting the weather.
And so the groundhog trapped Phil in a time loop like some capricious time god. It's only at the end when Phil publicly gives the great speech about the people, place, and celebration in his news broadcast that the loop ends. So the demon that trapped Phil in the Eternal Recurrence is literally Punxsutawney Phil. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. Many people on the internet think that this could be the right way to interpret the movie. In the words of one such Reddit post, Phil isn't a squirrel and he isn't predicting shit. He's a motherfucking groundhog and he decides when the seasons change. I kind of like this interpretation. It's ridiculous, but it's just as valid as any other reading. But as hilarious as this is, and as much evidence as there might be for it in the film, it's besides the point. The fact that the movie purposefully leaves out the cause and reason for the loop leaves the story wide open to all interpretations. I think that any attempt at an explanation is antithetical to the point of the Eternal Recurrence and to the point of the movie. The point has always been the loop itself, not how it came to be and not how to get out of it. I think we can all agree that Groundhog Day is incredibly funny, but also extremely smart, and this was only a quick look into a few different ideas. My bibliography for this video is starting to get a little long, but it's part of the charm of the movie, and I think it explains its position in the zeitgeist. There's a reason that there are so many time loop movies now, and some of them are really good, but I don't think any of them ever measure up when compared to the original. Not because they're not great, and not because they just copied the basic plot conceit, but because they're usually preoccupied with how the loop starts and why it ends. The beauty of Groundhog Day is that the loop appears to be random, and this allows for many different interpretations. Whether that's the Eternal Recurrence, a Judeo-Christian allegory, a Buddhist interpretation of cycles, or even an all-powerful time-bending woodchuck. Whatever your interpretation is, Groundhog Day is still an amazing movie with a great story that presents a lot of existential and moral questions to its audience, and gives them the opportunity to apply their own interpretation. What is it that makes Phil change and why? I don't have the answers, but it sure is fun to think about while we're watching this film. And that is why Groundhog Day is super smart and exceedingly existential. Here are my stray thoughts. If you're interested in hearing more about fiction as thought experiments, I have a whole episode on The Good Place which explores that. If you're interested in reading up on any of the other topics I touched on, I put together an extensive list of literature for this episode, and all citations are in the description. You can also check out this playlist I have on existentialism. I have to say, I really like the idea of Punxsutawney Phil being the demon that Nietzsche referenced. It's a whole new dimension to this movie. I think I might have to rewatch this one again, and again, and again. Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. Groundhog Day is a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed talking about existentialism, and this video was sort of a nice overview. If you're looking for more in-depth stuff, that episode on Soul I did, as well as Rick and Morty, and I do touch on it a little bit in Severance, although I would not call that episode existentialist per se. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you'll never miss another episode or anything else we got going on right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.